to the live stream if I have any viewers whatsoever. And today is the day of the death of Queen Elizabeth II. I've got to tone down my own sound. Who ruled remarkably, it's not the correct word, who sat upon the throne for 70 years. 70 years helping to maintain the stability of a large number of countries for whom she was the monarch. Ostensibly the head of state for many places. So I released a brief podcast about that today, and what I think is the things that distinguish the Westminster system, from which all other democracies have been derived. England was the first to have a parliamentary style democracy, and since then, other nations have aped that system more or less closely, some rather distantly in certain respects, where they've had a concentration rather than a sort of a dissolution of power, which is interesting. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to pose them. I haven't checked to see if anyone sent anything via Twitter, which I better do now. No, not really. Yes, and so the interesting thing about the British system is, as I said there, it is one of the antecedent reasons for this tradition of criticism, which has sprung up repeatedly throughout history, but has only been sustained since the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment began in Britain. When we speak of the Enlightenment, it's interesting. It's often regarded as being a European movement, but in fact, as some historians have pointed out, this is a misreading of what actually happened. The philosophers like Kant and people in that tradition from the continent of Europe, German intellectuals, certainly French intellectuals, although they are called Enlightenment thinkers, their version of Enlightenment, especially when it came to the philosophy of politics, was very much opposed to the style of thinking that was going on in Britain, in particular in places like Scotland, where you had David Hume. There, the idea was a repudiation of authority very much. And so the traditions that fed into individual rights and a representative parliamentary system where the monarch slowly lost power over time. I say slowly, it was sort of in discrete steps, all the way from the Magna Carta through to what happened to Charles I, and then all the way through to the modern era, where the monarch is no longer a ruler in the sense of making rules. But the Enlightenment tradition was that tradition of criticizing sources of knowledge such as authorities, whether it was the authoritative text, whether it was the authoritative political ruler, like an actual tyrannical monarch, or whether it was the authority of church. And so Britain escaped from that by a tradition, a culture of thinking, which obviously was the groundwork necessary for a modern conception of science as well. So all of these things were happening there. Over on the continent, in places like Germany, what you had was a tradition of philosophers there and thinkers, and the philosophers feed into broader intellectual culture, which feeds into political culture, ways of thinking, ways of setting up institutions in particular, where in Europe, the idea is that a concentration of power isn't necessarily the best thing. Isn't necessarily the worst thing, I should say. Isn't necessarily the worst thing, because you kind of need someone to guide society in the right direction. This is Plato's idea. Plato recognized that there were these different forms of government, recognized that, well, there is tyranny. Tyranny is the bastardized form of, or the incorrect form of, where you have a philosopher king installed who knows what the right thing is to do. And Plato thought, well, your only other option really is where you've got aristocrats being in charge, and they're going to squabble amongst themselves. And the bastardized form of that is like an oligarchy, like you might have in kind of like in Russia, but really Putin's in charge there. But if you have a group of just rich people today being in charge, you have an oligarchy. Plato recognized that could be a possible way that society could govern itself. Or you could have what he called democracy. And what he meant by democracy is rule by everyone, rule by the mob. And clearly that's a bad idea. Clearly, if you have rule by the mob where everyone just gets a vote on legislation, then what goes wrong is the majority rules over the minority, and the minority can lose all their rights. Not a good idea. So Plato's solution was, well, we should have philosopher kings. And various other people followed in that tradition, didn't criticize Plato, and those people were the European Enlightenment thinkers, people like Kant, who said, well, yeah, obviously, we need strong government in a way. We think we need voting systems. We need that style of electing representatives, but ultimately we need someone who's strong there, who's able to make the correct laws. And so it was all about a confirmation style of politics, unlike in Britain, where you had a rejection of that Platonic ideal. And they didn't articulate it well back then, but Popper did. Popper said, well, Plato has got it all wrong. What democracy is not rule by the majority. We're not in politics trying to figure out a system for how to install the best rulers. That's not what our problem situation is. Our situation is that if we're going to have a system of government if we're going to have any system of government at all, if we're not going to go down the anarchy route, and we're not going to because people are irrational, people are necessarily going to come into conflict, and there needs to be some form of arbitration, and there needs to be a monopoly on violence and these kind of things. Popper understood this. Then our situation is, what style of government do we need? And he said, well, the answer is not to be concerned about who's going to rule. That's not the question that political philosophy needs to answer. The question rather is, once you've got a ruler of whatever kind, how can they be removed without violence? And that's the true answer to what democracy is all about. You hear these people sometimes in the United States, intellectuals over there saying, we're not a democracy, we're a republic. But they don't understand what a democracy actually is. They're thinking of the Platonic idea of democracy. They're thinking of a democracy is ruled by the mob. And we're not that. We're a republic. But it's a misunderstanding of what democracy is. The United States is both a republic and a democracy simultaneously. These things are not in conflict. But I think the reason it's said is because it's the Republicans saying it. It's the Republican intellectuals who say it. You hear people like Ben Shapiro say it, various other right-leaning people in the United States who comment on politics are apt to say this because they're Republicans. They're not Democrats, and they want to cast the Democrats as being wrong in a foundational way, namely, well, the Democrats are on the side of democracy, the Republicans are on the side of the republic. But this is just a complete misunderstanding of the term democracy. If they want to call it that, fine. But the United States has a kinship with the Westminster system. It basically gets most of its system from the Westminster system, but it has this president as well that has all these powers, which is aping continental Europe. So they've tried to mesh together bits of the French system and bits of the British system. You put these two things together, and what comes out the end is the American system. The American system has the parliamentary virtues of a bicameral house. Like you have the Congress, like the House of Representatives, and you have the Senate, like the House of Lords. So in that sense, it's British. But on the other hand, the president has all of this power, vast amounts of power, which is like the French system. In the French system, the president there has huge amounts of power, even more than what the American system, what the United States president has over the states. In the British system, in the Australian system, Canadian system, the prime minister, ostensibly the equivalent of the president, has nowhere near as much power. It's ruled by cabinets. So it's the prime minister's just sort of like he does have some power, but he or she basically is just the executive in the meetings and stuff, coordinates who the ministers are going to be in some cases when it gets more complicated, but they have way less power than what the president does, way less. They can't just make executive decisions, which is what the president does. The president can decide to go to war, for example. The Australian prime minister cannot choose to do that. It has to be an act of the executive, which is a vote among the cabinet ministers. So in that sense, I think it's, if you want to talk democracy, more democratic in that sense. It's much more difficult to remove the American president. So by Popper's metric, it's a less democratic system. When you begin concentrating power in that way, and you have the possibility, the potential of concentrating power in that way, it doesn't meet Popper's criterion. And in that sense, it leans more towards the Europeans. But America and the United States, unfortunately, does have this tradition politically of cleaving to continental European philosophy in a number of ways. And it's because, the founders were very much on the side of the French intellectuals at the time. Traditionally, France has been a great friend to the United States. Also looks down their nose at them. And so there's this interesting relationship between the United States and Britain historically, of course, because, the United States and France historically, of course, because both of them had a common enemy at some point with Britain. Yeah. No questions today. That's interesting. So reflecting on political systems, which isn't usually my thing, I wouldn't have done that today because I'm doing the series of M's, and my next one was actually going to be either memes or minds, which are related. And so it'll probably end up being memes, which will make a transition to minds, because memes are about ideas that can must cause behavior in order to spread and become memes. Not all ideas constitute memes. Some ideas you can just have, they come in and out of your head and then they go again. If that's the case, can't possibly be a meme. A meme has to be something that causes a behavior such that then causes it to get copied and replicated. So this is another M. But memes are had in minds, yet another M. What's a mind? A mind, in my conception, is that it's the entity that comes up with the ideas. So that's what a person is. A person is a mind. It's the thing that generates the ideas. Identical to none of the ideas. But you have a personal identity over time. You have a personality, and the personality has to come down to some extent to your ideas. But personal identity, this whole question in philosophy, is a deep and complex one that I don't think anyone necessarily has a good final answer to. We only have some hints about what it means to be a person. At the moment, the best working hypothesis is people are universal explainers. What's a universal explainer? That entity which is able to understand, comprehend, build a model of anything else in physical reality, any phenomena that's out there, even if that phenomena is on the other side of the universe, something like a quasar, which is the go-to example quite often that I use. But it need not be far and distant. It can just be nearby, atomic size or subatomic size. In that case, your physical theories are going to be the thing that is instantiated in your mind and causing that mind to be like the rest of physical reality, which is something I try and talk about a lot. This very interesting self-similarity that we have with the rest of physical reality. The rest of physical reality being infinitely complex, but our knowledge of it at any given time not infinitely complex. Always finite, partial, apt to improvement over time. Yes, I am unable to see the chat. I don't know why. Someone has just sent me a message saying that I can't see the chat. I don't know why. I don't know why I can't see the chat. How curious. Oh, no, yeah. I don't know what, something was switched off, so now I can see it. Apologies, I can now see the chat. I'll go through. Would love to thank you, Jun. Would love to hear any specific thoughts you might have on Stoicism. Yeah, so this, apologies for the noise outside. This, to my mind, is the Western version of the insights that are found in the East in Buddhism. I think that people, when it comes to both of these kinds of philosophy, these ways of thinking about the world and interacting with the world, I should say, there's an extent to which people need these things more or less. They become interested in them more or less because of the problem situation that they have. And I think everyone is going to be prone at some point or other to finding these philosophies useful. Sometimes people find them useful for their entire lives, and others don't. Others can dip in and out of these things and find that, well, this whole idea of trying to find peace, for example, find tranquility in one's own life, either it's helpful at a particular point and then you can drop it, or some people it becomes an entire lifestyle where they are practicing these things every day. They become deeply embedded in it in precisely the same way that people do with religion. And this is why I think religion is good for many people. And then other people find it not so helpful. But it's often the people that find religion not so helpful that will then turn to philosophies like Stoicism or other kinds of ways of introspecting and having personal philosophies about how to move through life. Yeah. So I don't have any specific thoughts on it. I think all these things are useful. And insofar as they point to universal truths, then they're found in a multiple number of places. But I'm happy to hear other people's thoughts on this, who will know more about this. I read Seneca, but I mean, it's been a while now. It's one of those things where I think, oh, that's interesting, possibly true. But yeah, I haven't studied it in depth. Tadas, can you comment on how art and knowledge creation are related? Do you think epistemology is a useful study for creating art specifically? Well, knowledge creation covers all kinds of creation. One thing I would say about art here is that there are two opposing movements in art. There is the tradition of art that preserves what art always was until very recently, which is this idea that there is an objective aesthetic to aspire to. There's a kind of truth there in art. Truth is beauty, that kind of thing. And knowledge creation in art, therefore, would be about finding new ways and new modes of expressing beauty. That's classic art. And one might say that's genuine art. But there was a movement that began only in the 20th century, really, where it was a rejection of all that art became less about pursuing beauty for its own sake, and instead being about political movements, making commentary on whatever was going on parochially at a given time. And so still today, we have these museums of modern art, which are less about, sometimes they are, less about typically beauty, but there are exceptions, and more about trying to make political comments. Yeah, forms of, I guess, forms of propaganda, a postmodern rejection of classic art. And so knowledge creation, to my mind, would be related to the arts in understanding there is this objective truth. You can move towards it or away from it, or you can reject all of this together, which is what modern art can sometimes be. So is epistemology useful for that? Insofar as you accept that there is ways of objectively improving. And that is a minority view now in the arts. I would say an exceedingly minority view now in the arts, because people often now are told in the arts, well, it's subjective. It's just your matter of taste. If you like it or you don't like it, it doesn't matter. Everyone has their own opinion about what art is, and that's all that matters. It's relative to who you are. A Papirian might say, well, yeah, we all have our opinions, but that doesn't change the fact there is an objective truth about what is beautiful and what is not. We don't know the standards of beauty. That should be the job of art, to try and figure out what are some of these objective standards of beauty, because we're only scratching the surface. But rejecting the whole idea that there can be objective beauty means it brings artistic knowledge creation to a halt. So that's where I would say that epistemology can be useful. Black Locust. Of all the material I've heard from you, yours and David Deutsch's views on the mainstream view on IQ seems the least plausible. Yeah, it's this is one of the areas where you are pushing up against decades of what I would say is a deeply embedded set of misconceptions in what I have to regard, what I have to call pseudoscience. And Popper recognized this, that psychology he called out specifically, along with Marxism, putting them into the same bin as astrology, essentially, where they tried to be predictive in a sense without being explanatory. So everyone agrees that if you perform well on an IQ test, that's predictive. And so people like Jordan Peterson will say, well, therefore it's scientific. Look, we can predict. Not realizing that that is not the measure of what's scientific. Anyone can make predictions and make accurate predictions at that. But unless you have an explanation, you're not doing science, because you could be making the correct prediction for all the wrong reasons. And in the case of IQ, what you're doing is you're measuring the capacity of someone to gain the knowledge that's required in order to succeed through life. Call that IQ if you want, but it's not a deep indication of the person's capacity to generate explanations, the measure of a person. And to that extent, we're all equal in that way. But, you know, psychologists need to be employed. And one way to be employed is to say they have the way of assessing people and to put them into categories called IQ. And it keeps them employed because, hey, big employers want to know that the employees that they're hiring, the candidates, can be rank ordered in some way if they've got nothing else to go on. But it rarely comes down to that anyway. I mean, what's the point of IQ? Really pursue it. What is the point of IQ? Apart from categorizing and rank ordering people, may as well do height and weight. How of what use is that? Maybe in a medical situation, but what medical situation would be helped by knowing someone's IQ? If you're employing someone and you want someone with the high IQ, well, first interview them and see if they've got the specialist knowledge that you need. There's already examinations for this, by the way. Yeah. Mathematics results are often used as a proxy for IQ anyway. IQ is refuted by the known good explanation of people as universal explainers. Whatever is required to understand how to answer IQ test questions better can be learned by anyone. Full stop. That's all. The only reason people won't gain the knowledge is because they're not interested in gaining the knowledge. That's it. That's it. And people can object to this all they like. It's just the truth. You can say, well, not everyone's equal as universal explainer. Okay, well, you can believe that. People have believed that all, throughout human history. They used to say it about women. They used to say it about people with different skin color. They say it now about children. And some people just want to say, well, no, there are some people who are just less capable intellectually than others inherently, not realizing it just comes down to their interest. But, people like to categorize. This is, I don't want to say it's the human condition. It's an unfortunate, deeply embedded meme in the culture that we should categorize each other. Categorize each other on the basis of gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity. Throw IQ in there. It's the same kind of thing, rather than just treating everyone as equal. And if you want to figure out if the person sitting in front of you is the candidate for the job, is going to be suitable for the job, then talk to them, interview them. Say, oh, but I want to do an IQ test. Okay, do a test. Do a test. But just don't think that it gives you an inherent insight into the person's capability to learn the job, let's say, which is what you're supposed to, what you say you're doing this interview for. Okay, that's it. Can you please explain what is biological knowledge and is it different from explanatory knowledge? Yes, these are the two kinds of knowledge. Knowledge in general, let's just think about knowledge in the broad sense. Knowledge in the broad sense is useful information. Useful information. Why is it useful? It's useful because it solves a problem of some kind. And because it does these things, because it's useful and solves a problem, they kind of mutually define each other, it gets copied and transmitted in some way. Now, in terms of biology, this is the genes for certain adaptations in the environment. So biological knowledge is the knowledge that is useful information that is in the genome, the DNA of an organism, that does things like code for wings of birds. Very useful, the wings of birds, aren't they? That's useful information. It's a solution to a problem. It helps the bird to fly and get away from predators, right? Our legs in general, biological knowledge of how to move an organism more quickly than without legs, let's say, on land. And to get upstairs more easily and that kind of thing. So the adaptations that biological organisms have constitute knowledge of how to survive in an environment. They are a solution to particular problems. And so therefore the genes get passed on from generation to generation. And so that's the copying that we've got now. So that's that knowledge, biological knowledge. Explanatory knowledge, well, analogously, it is useful. Newtonian gravity is useful. Quantum theory is useful. The theory of evolution by natural selection is useful. Mathematics is useful. And because these theories, these ideas solve a problem. And so because they're useful, they get copied and they get passed on, again, from generation to generation. They get copied into books and copied into computers and transmitted around the world. And so the explanatory knowledge is the far more powerful of the two. And increasingly, it will be the knowledge that takes command of the entire universe over time. Biological knowledge is just a prelude. It's just the very beginning of knowledge creation. Explanatory knowledge creation, what you get in minds, means we escape from the DNA. The knowledge that's in the DNA is fixed in any given organism. In people, for example, although we've got genetic engineering now, we can sort of start playing with that. But basically, it's very, very slow to evolve. So on any given lifetime, per individual species, individual within a species, the DNA is fixed. Okay, but it changes over, geological time, sort of thing, maybe a bit faster than that. Whereas explanatory knowledge changes very, very rapidly, very rapidly. Every time a new iPhone comes out, that's more explanatory knowledge that had to be created to put into that thing. So you're getting hugely rapid rate of increase of knowledge and improvement of knowledge in terms of explanatory knowledge. Isn't your view, Black Locus, rather akin to the blank slate view of the human mind? I reject the blank slate of the human mind. I've got a YouTube video out there saying that the blank slate and genetic determinism are both false. This is the way this tension is usually presented, that, well, either the contents of our minds have been inherited through our genes in some way and determine our behavior. This is evolutionary psychology, right? Evolutionary psychology says at least some, not all, but at least some of your behaviors are determined by the content of your genes. So somehow the genes contain information that gets into your mind, compelling you to do certain stuff. So you're born with these ideas and they make you do certain stuff. That's evolutionary psychology. The blank slate, on the other hand, says you're born with no ideas whatsoever. I reject both. Both of these are wrong. You are born with ideas, but they don't determine your behavior. Not for long, anyway. Not for long. These ideas that you're born with can help the baby to survive for a while. Babies can, for example, they have a natural instinct. They can swim. Yeah. They know how to eat and drink. Okay, so they've got these ideas, but they need to improve that, by the way. They improve the ways in which they eat and drink over time. And there's probably a whole bunch of ideas that are in there, inexplicit, can't be expressed in words because the baby can't talk, but there must be ideas there about how to learn how to talk, right? But for any of these ideas that are there, they're ideas. So how they got there is irrelevant. Once they're in the mind, they're then subject to the usual rules of conjecture and criticism. They can be changed over time. Sure, sometimes it's hard to change them. Sure, sometimes people don't change them. But the point is, in principle, they could be changed. And so this is why the blank slate is false. We're born with ideas, but why evolutionary psychology has the wrong emphasis. It says that the ideas come through the genes, but it doesn't recognize the fact that even were that true, and I'm not entirely sure the extent to which it is. If we say any content of the mind is an idea, okay, maybe it provides sensations. Like, for example, is hunger an idea that you have? The idea that you're hungry? You have the sensation of hunger or thirst. Okay, let's stick with hunger. You want to eat something. Well, that's genetic, yeah. But the difference, so I would say, that, okay, evolutionary psychology would agree with that and would see that as something in support of the notion that somehow it's correct. But it goes a bit further usually. It says, well, it determines your behavior, but how can it when people, unlike other animals, when hungry and offered food, will sometimes refuse to take it, sometimes refuse to eat? Explain that. It's because they have ideas. Now, sometimes they will eat, sometimes they won't. The point is, it's a choice. But if my cat is hungry and I put food in front of it, it doesn't make a choice like that. It never rejects it. It doesn't think to itself, well, I've had enough food. Sometimes it'll eat again and throw up. I've heard Labradors are a dog that certain individuals in the Labrador species will eat themselves to death. If you keep on feeding it, it will just eat itself to death. It gets so fat, and it doesn't reflect on its own behavior. And dogs are some of the smarter animals, right? So pick any other animal, and they're more stupid than that. Yeah. So the point is, we have instincts like animals. Those instincts, if they constitute ideas, they're in our genes in some way, shape, or form. But we can make a choice about whether or not to follow what our instinct is suggesting we do or reject it, unlike an animal that only ever follows its instincts. Yeah. A friend, Vladimir, has asked, a friend asked you this on Twitter regarding AI. When you talk about the current state of AI, you say it's a bunch of if-then statements, but it's not. In reference to Deep Blue, was an expert system if-then knowledge came from without. But the AI systems today seem to have an implicit hypothesis about the world on their own, create some implicit knowledge that wasn't programmed into them. The famous Move 3. Interested to hear your view on this distinction. It's not knowledge because it never gets outside of, it's not able to conjecture something that isn't already within the confines of the code. It can make predictions, sure, no doubt. But a prediction does not count as knowledge. And just because, and this is really important as well, just because operators cannot explain what it's doing is not a refutation of the claim it's not creating knowledge. So what? They can't explain what it's doing. They program the thing and then they don't know how it's doing what it does. It's like cooks will bake cakes, stick them in the oven, and won't be able to explain exactly what's going on. But they're the ones that have put the whole thing together. One would say, well, it's not the same analogy. Why not? This is a complex thing, a complex bunch of code that by their own lights, they're saying they don't understand. So just because they don't understand it doesn't mean we then leap to, well, therefore it's knowledge creation. It just means they don't understand how the thing is doing what it's doing. But what it's not doing is doing anything other than making moves in Go. That's all it's doing. If it was to begin talking to you, then I would say, yeah, it's made a conjecture and it's constructed some knowledge, something completely unexpected, completely from the realm of conjecture and guess. But this is not that. This is, look, put it this way. It's a system that's been programmed to play the game Go. And the best that someone can offer me is it made a move in the game Go that person says they don't understand. Therefore, it created knowledge. Or it made a move in Go that no one had made before and they don't understand how. They don't understand how. Okay, so you're not understanding, your lack of imagination about how your own system works is not, to me, compelling evidence in favor of, therefore, this thing is creating knowledge and it's got some sort of kind of intelligence or versions of intelligence that hitherto we don't understand. It's exactly the same as the people who say they've seen UFOs. They see lights in the sky. They say UFO. It's unidentified. You don't know what it is. You don't then leap from that to, therefore, it's aliens from the other side of the galaxy visiting to us. You don't know. You're ignorant. Until they have a good explanation of what's going on, forget it. I can quite easily. It is a bunch of if-then statements, by the way. These neural networks. You read about these neural networks. It's complex, sure, but it's still about Bayesian inference generation, and sure. It's more sophisticated than other stuff's being done, but that's it. And I think that one thing about some coders is that they're very poor at explaining what they do. This is one issue. And the other issue is marketing, that they want to hype up what some of these systems are doing. And so it's a marketing exercise to say, this system that we've got, this black box, and often won't tell you what's going on, we have this algorithm, this secret algorithm that can do what it does. We don't know how it works. You don't know how it works, but it's doing these amazing things. It's similar to quantum computation sometimes. You get these industry types. Google will put out press releases, it seems, every second year saying, we now have the quantum computer that's achieved quantum supremacy and it's better than any system that's gone before. Oh, really? How does it work? Oh, we can't tell you that. That's commercial in confidence. It's copyright. Well, that's not a compelling argument. They say, oh, well, we did the experiment, here's the outcome of the experiment. Explain it. I can't explain it, but you're not telling me how it works. So why should I grant that this thing is a quantum computer when you haven't given me the plans to it? You're just saying it is, and that it's doing all of this stuff, and here's your experiment. But what are you testing? What's the theory that you're testing? You're not giving me the theory of its operation. So how can I know? Because every time, by the way, that this has been suggested, we've found now recently that someone says they've achieved quantum supremacy. In other words, the computer that can do things faster than any other computer, it then gets falsified like a couple of months later by a regular computer doing exactly that thing. So I'm saying that this is on a continuum with that. That when people say, I've got the AI system that's able to create knowledge, look, oh yeah, why? How do you know it creates knowledge? Because here's something we can't explain. We don't know how it does it. It's like DALL-E, the art thing. Some people will say, oh, we don't understand how it's exactly doing this. Okay, You don't understand, right? That's where the conversation stops. I think that they don't. It's not that they. It is that they don't understand, but they also can't explain. Okay, now it hasn't. Because of that, it hasn't been worth my while to like investigate deeply into some of these things. You might say, "Oh, so you're ignorant?" Yeah, sure, I'm ignorant, but they're ignorant, and so it's just a whole bunch of ignorance, and so we're not getting anywhere. But they can claim it's knowledge creation, but knowledge knowledge comes in two types, as I just explained: biological and explanatory. So, which form is this? Oh, it's a third form. Oh, really? Give me some details about what this third form of knowledge is. Because I'd love it. That's something in my wheelhouse I could actually sink my teeth into, but I don't. Okay. Yes, I was unable to see the chat, as someone has said. Adil, what's a good refutation to evolutionary psychology? The core idea that human knowledge, what is potentially obtainable, is ultimately bounded by genes and evolves psychological. Oh, yeah, that's a good one. So that's related to this. Yes. So evolutionary psychology, this core idea that because our brain has evolved, it's evolved to exist. There's a few ways of stating this in middle world. So we can understand only things that are about human size, or understand things that are our ancestors on the African savannah were able to understand. Yeah, and so this is, Dawkins has this argument, Richard Dawkins. I suppose he spawned the entire movement, but I wouldn't blame him for the strange directions that people have gone off into. There are some people who make reasonable sense on a lot of other issues, even on psychology to some extent, like Brett Weinstein. But then they just take it too far. So the thing about this is that it conflates the physical and the abstract, brains and minds. So yeah, the brain is an evolved structure, and the rest of our physical body is evolved. So we are restricted because of our physical biology at the moment, until such time as we can build better bodies, which is, we're just entering the stage of being able to do that. People giving people bionic legs and arms, and artificial hearts, and so on and so forth, and that will just continue apace. Eventually, regular healthy people will start choosing to have bionic arms and legs and stuff because they'll last longer, and certainly hearts and maybe even brains. But the problem with this claim, the claim being, because our brain has evolved, we can't possibly understand anything that is outside of human-sized stuff. So therefore, we can't have a good understanding of particle physics. We can't have a good understanding of gravity and cosmology and that kind of thing. It's too big for us or too small for us. We can only understand the stuff that we've evolved to be capable of understanding. It misunderstands what understanding is. It doesn't have a conception of what knowledge creation is. It doesn't recognize that the mind is an abstract thing, a kind of software running on the brain. And the mind of the human is categorically different to whatever is governing the behavior of any other creature on earth. And if you struggle with this, I don't know why, because all you need to do is to look around. What does brown bear society look like? What does the civilization of honeybees look like? What does whale art and science look like? And of course, at this point, some people do become completely irrational. They say, well, you don't know about bee society. The honeybee has a complex society where there's a queen and there's a hive and all this sort of stuff. You don't understand. You don't understand whales. You don't know that their songs aren't actually conveying complex mathematical structure and the deep laws of the physics. Well, I think that's irrational, because if you can create explanatory knowledge, then you can escape from the environment in which nature has put you. Look around and look at the rich society, civilizations, built environment of the human being. It's completely different. We can go into any environment and survive. We can go to the bottom of the ocean in robust submarines and survive. No whale has a device to come onto land with, unless we want it to. No honeybee can build a rocket to go to the moon. It doesn't matter what the environment is, the depths of space, the bottom of the ocean, anywhere in between, the hottest environment, the coldest environment available on Earth, we don't care. What's going on with us? We are not constrained by our evolved minds. Our evolved minds have caused us to fly free of the genes. So, ultimately bounded, the idea that, well, just you wait, we will encounter the bound, is just an appeal to the supernatural. Just you wait, God is going to judge us all. Just you wait, you'll find out that those lights in the sky really were aliens. Just you wait, the thing will come that we won't be able to explain. And then us evolutionary psychologists will be proved right after all. Well, so far so good. Okay, you can believe that. You can have this weird irrational belief. Or you can hedge your money on every time we encounter a problem, we tend to solve it. And so far, our bodies which have been evolved have not prevented us from surviving in any environment. We continue to build our own bodies and build the environment around us. We do not have to adapt to the environment. We adapt the environment to us. And there is no limit because we're universal explainers. We're unbounded in our capacity to explain any physical phenomena. And that's because every single physical phenomena out there is provably computable. By David Deutsch, by the way, who proved this theorem. And we can instantiate simple computers. We can do what computers can do. And so therefore we can compute any physical process that we encounter. Therefore, we can explain anything that is explicable as well, because explanation is just a kind of computation. So this physics refutes biology. If there's a law of physics, and this is a law of physics, by the way, this idea that every physical phenomena is computable, the universality of computation is, well, actually it's deeper than a law of physics, it's a principle of physics. Every other physical law has to comport with that principle. So never mind what evolutionary biology says, they can't violate physical laws. They may as well say that evolution, they may as well honestly say this, well, evolution has made the human body, you just look at the structure of the legs, just look at the bones and look at the muscles. It's impossible from an evolutionary standpoint for a human being to ever exceed 30 kilometers per hour. We've done the calculations, it just can't be done. There's no way the legs can move that fast. Yeah, but we can still move faster than that. We can move, at like Mach 15 in a rocket, go down the street in a bus at 60 kilometers an hour. It's trivially easy to travel faster than what evolution has restricted our bones to and our muscles. So never mind what, you say our genes have given our brains the capacity for in terms of memory and processing speed. That's not the crucial factor. It's the ideas that we can have, which cause us to fly free of the constraints of our body in every other respect, and can cause us to fly free of what the previous generation thought was a bound on what we could possibly think. In that sense, evolutionary psychology, evolutionary biology is a good science. Evolutionary psychology is just another religion. It's just saying, like religion did, you've got no right to try and think about that stuff because that's the domain of God. Evolutionary psychology just says, you can't possibly think about that stuff because we haven't been evolved in order to have the capacity to think about that stuff. And even if you can't point at a particular thing today, just you wait, you'll find out. Eventually, there'll be something you can't explain. Black Locust again. Are truth, beauty, and goodness in the moral sense synonymous? Or are they all strands of the same string, as I believe I heard Jacob Bronowski say, or something? So, yeah, I think they're basically pointing at the same thing. Exactly. Yes. What is good is what is true morally. What is beautiful is what is true aesthetically. These are all different kinds of truth. And I am someone who endorses realism, and realism says that There's an objective reality out there. And in terms of morality and beauty, you can have closer to true representations of that. In other words, more beautiful, more good ways to go in that area. You can either move towards the beauty and the truth and the good, or away from it. There's a rank ordering system there. There's worse things and there's better things. So this is what morality to some extent is about. What should we do next? How to make a better choice about how to move in the right direction. Black Locust, doesn't Walter Mischaf's famous marshmallow experiment, specifically how our earliest traits hold constant love, contradict the Deutschian idea that all people are equal universal explainers? No, it doesn't. Of course not. In fact, it shows the opposite, because if people were not equal in some way, shape, or form, then shouldn't we expect them all to be making the same choice? But they don't, you know. Some kids eat the marshmallow straight away. I think it's a cruel and terrible experiment. I don't think it shows anything. I don't know why people egg up this marshmallow experiment a lot. It's just a way of torturing children. It's like, oh, look, they don't have impulse control and something. And then it's, again, predictive at later life that, oh, the little kid, he had the marshmallow first and later on he's impulsive. Yeah. These are poorly controlled studies. The longitudinal reliability of these things, terrible. Psychology you really have to look at with a very critical eye. It's all predictive. Even when they claim it's predictive, it's very rarely replicable. They admit themselves there's a replicability crisis. They can't repeat their own experiments. That's one thing. That's not the worst thing. The worst thing is they can't explain stuff. They don't know the first thing about what a universal explainer is. They don't know the first thing about what an explanation is. They're not interested in explanation. So much of this is academic psychology. I would say real psychology, you know, well, there's two sorts of real psychology. Real psychology in terms of academia should be about memes. How do the ideas in the mind come to be generated and be passed on from generation to generation and spread through cultures? The little kid that chooses to eat the marshmallow or not has a particular idea about what's going on. They have ideas, right? And so those ideas can be acquired early on in life. And so they have an idea about, well, I want to eat the marshmallow now because I tend not to get marshmallows at home. Mum and Dad don't let me have marshmallows. So I'm going to eat it right now. I don't care if you tell me I'm going to be able to get 2 in 5 minutes. I haven't had a marshmallow ever in my life, or, you know, for the last 2 years. I've forgotten what it tastes like. I'm going to eat it now. And that same kid who has been deprived of stuff like that, yeah, later on in life, they're going to have a desire to try and get the thing now and have the thing now, because early on they have this idea. Does that mean they in principle can't change that idea? No, of course not. Of course not. They can change their idea. But not many people know this. And in fact, it's like a self-fulfilling prophecy. It's the psychologists and psychology that tells people, well, you're born this way and you can't change yourself. And look how predictive this behavior happens to be. If you keep on telling people, well, you're born this way and you can't change yourself, no wonder they don't. After all, that's the psychologist telling me. They know what they're talking about, don't they? No, they don't. No, they don't. They don't have the. It's a weird discipline where the experts are the people that are most mired in misconception. This has happened throughout the history of ideas. You know, it used to happen in physics. I mean, for millennia, or millennia and a half, you know, Aristotle's physics held sway. Every physicist or natural philosopher engaged in science was laboring under just a massive misconception. So true psychology should be about memes and how the ideas get into the mind. Explanatory, not merely predictive. The other kind of good psychology is, of course, merely counseling. You know, the town psychologist or counselor who's not going to go talk about marshmallows and all this stuff, is actually going to help people work through their problems, let's say. That's a virtuous form of psychology, useful. Psychological experiment, you know, they do psychology in high school now. I worked at a school where they had psychology. And the experiments they did were science in form only. In form only. It's like, you know, silly things like, let's have 2 groups of people, 20 people in each group. one listening to classical music, one not. Let's give each individual in each group 10 words to remember off by heart and see who does better. Oh, the people who listen to classical music while trying to memorize stuff did better. Therefore, classical music helps you remember stuff. Stuff like that. And the professional psychologists are doing more fancier versions of that. There's no explanation as to how the classical music might do it. If it does, if you repeat the experiment for different kinds of people under different conditions and so on and so forth, they don't try and refute their own theories because they don't have a theory to begin with, which is the whole purpose of an experiment. The whole purpose of an experiment is to try and refute a theory. Okay. Christo, how do severely disabled people fit into your view of persons' universal? People love this. It's like they refute, they don't like the universal explainer idea. What about apes? Well, apes are not universal explainers. No, not in any way, shape, or form. We deal with this in the podcast, and David deals with this in the beginning of Infinity. Apes, which display complex behaviors, and they appear to have emotions, they appear to have fun, and dogs can appear to have fun, they appear to have language and all this stuff. It's called behavior passing, which I won't go through right now, but in their genes, they can have the capacity for memes for a certain kind of idea. We can grant that, but it's fixed. It's a fixed repertoire of it's like a toolkit. So imagine you've got this toolkit of ideas, of memes, but the toolkit is fixed. But you can do stuff with the toolkit, right? You can rearrange the tools, but the thing you can't do, this is behavior passing. The toolkit, the fixed toolkit, is create new tools. You can't create new tools, but human beings can. That's our universal explanation stuff. We can create the idea that leads to another idea. We can create the theory of physics that leads to the better computer. We can create the theory of thermodynamics that leads to the better engine. And then once we've got the better engine, to the better car. And so it's ideas upon ideas upon ideas. But other animals that have memes, that we grant have memes that can spread through a culture, like great apes, for example, they can't generate new ideas, but they can repurpose a fixed set of ideas, a very limited number of ideas. So, for example, they can ape. Okay, one ape can look at another ape that's doing a particular thing, like cracking a nut, and can learn by trying out those behaviors because they've got a certain fixed number of behaviors within the repertoire, which is greater than for other animals. And so you can have this spreading of memes, but it's not a conjecture of explanations is the key point. So there's those creatures are on a continuum, all the way from insects, okay, which might have the very nascent ideas that control their behavior, all the way through to somewhat more complex set of memes. So you're just getting increasing the number of memes, but you always have a fixed finite number of memes in principle. Unlike with humans, where we're off axis because there's no limit to the number of memes. It's an unbounded infinite set. So that's severely disabled people. It depends on what you're talking about. Certainly there could be a case to be made for where a person has ceased to be able to have ideas. In which case, you get to, it's called a vegetative state for a reason. Now, if the person's in a locked in state, well, that's not vegetative. That is a person who that is completely disabled, completely immobile, can't move arms nor legs or anything. That's disabled by any stretch of the imagination. But their mind is perfectly well functioning. I mean, Stephen Hawking ended up like that, more or less. As for other people with conditions that slow their mind, all I would say is that they slow their mind. In principle, they could learn anything that anyone else does, but one, they don't have an interest in, and that interest could be affected by the fact that their mind is operating at a somewhat slower pace. And this is true. I think that people do have differences in the speed with which they can think, but that doesn't change the fact that in theory, they could in principle learn anything at all. People with, for example, Down syndrome, I think, let's say, for example, they are treated a certain way early on in life by the people around them, however compassionately and friendly, but they are treated by society as not being capable of learning certain things very early on. And so they don't. So there is a culture. There is a culture that we have of ways of interacting with these people that causes a culture in those people, ways of behaving in having a common set of behaviors, even if they're from completely different cultures. Like people in the United States and people in China can tend to treat people with Down syndrome in the same way. And if you're getting treated a certain way, you tend to behave a certain way. You respond in a certain. Human beings are very plastic, moldable, especially early on in life. And so this is what I would say explains some of these very minor disabilities that people have, which manifest as the apparent incapability of learning things like complex mathematics. But I would just say it's a disinterest because they've been taught that maybe they get distracted early on. They can, because their brain might operate at a different pace. That's all. But are absolutely, completely people in every way, shape, and form, because all you need is this capacity to explain universally, and they can because it does. A person with Down syndrome in a country that speaks English will learn English perfectly proficiently, and a person in China will learn Mandarin, and a person in France will learn French. So therefore, their mind is universal. They can learn anything. They can learn any language, right? So why not anything else? Can I expand on what it means for a problem to be solved? One say alcohol solves a problem for boredom, but obviously that can be unhealthy and create more problems. Yeah, of course. A problem, what it means for a problem to be solved means that problems are parochial. They're something that an individual has, or maybe a society has, but the opposite to parochial is universal. In other words, there's not one problem for all time for everyone everywhere. Parochial just means it's for a particular situation. So once the people in that situation, let's stick with individual, once it's satisfied to the individual's satisfaction, then it's solved. But all problems lead to more problems. Sometimes better, sometimes worse. Ideally, if you're genuinely solving the problem, then you're led to better problems. So in the case of the alcohol, if you're just having a glass of wine at night because you want to relax after a long day at work and you're sitting in front of the TV and you wake up the next morning without a hangover and you enjoyed that glass of wine and you enjoyed the television, you have nice memories of the previous night, yeah, you've solved your problem, because maybe you were sort of pent up and your heart was racing, your mind was racing after your long day at work, and you have the glass of wine and it calms that down. Problem solved. And you move on to better problems, namely, well, now I can sleep. And should I go to sleep now? Or should I go to sleep later? And so, yeah. But if it becomes alcoholism, you're quite right. Then you've got one problem, you're bored, leading to way worse problems, way worse problems of being unhealthy and getting cancer and all the things that alcohol is purported to do, if we listen to the scientists, which we should on this problem. Yeah. But what it means for a problem to be solved is, well, that's up to the individual who has the problem. If you have the problem, you will know whether it's solved or not. In the case of the alcohol, you'll know. If you wake up the next morning with a hangover, and that's just happening repeatedly, and you're then diagnosed with liver cancer by the doctor, and you keep on drinking, well, you're not solving the problem. The problem genuinely is not that you're bored at that point. The problem is something else is going on. Why are you having the alcohol to that extent all the time, every day? It speaks to something deeper, right? And this is true for any number of behaviors that people engage in where it could be boredom. Gambling might be one, whatever. Where in truth it's not boredom. In truth, it is a dissatisfaction with the contents of the mind when, without that stimulation, this inability of being able to be alone with one's thoughts. I think it plagues, I dare say, a majority of people. Unfortunately, if you can't be alone with your thoughts for an extended period of time, then that's an issue. And some people really enjoy spending time alone with their thoughts. And I think everyone should aspire to that, because then you can really address interesting problems. This is why great scientists are great scientists, because they can sit there thinking about a particular problem. A great writer, J.R.R. Tolkien, could not have gotten done what he did if he was a chronic alcoholic. He might have smoked a fair bit, but this cleared his mind. Apparently, he smoked a pipe all the time. He talks about this. He loved his pipe, but he was comfortable with his own thoughts, and you have to be at peace to a certain extent and find that tranquility. Black locust. What about the correlation between high IQ and ethnic groups like Jews? Again, no one is denying there's correlation. No one's denying there's predictive capacities. The Jewish culture has a long tradition of teaching people deep foundational knowledge. Jewish people, the tradition of religion there is to argue over the texts. They investigate Jewish culture a little bit deeply. They recognize the deep, rich intellectual culture there of not resting upon the authority of a priest so much as in the Islamic world, even in the Christian world, but instead having this rich culture of debate. They argue amongst themselves. That refines a certain kind of knowledge about how to critically think about stuff, but it's something that can be learned. It's not genetic, it's something that can be learned. You have to understand this. So this is a cultural thing, a deeply cultural thing. So no wonder they do well on IQ tests and they win more Nobel Prizes as compared by percentage compared to any other religion, that kind of thing. So yes, of course, but this is not a biological genetic thing. This is a cultural thing. And culture is a kind of knowledge, and knowledge can be learned. All you need to do, look, I was watching a thing the other day. It was fascinating about this Italian fellow who was, how did the story go? Anyway, he was Italian. He would just look like a normal Italian fellow, but he was taken at a very early age to live in rural China, and he grew up in rural China until, at the age of like 60, he looks like an Italian guy, but he speaks perfectly fluent Mandarin. In fact, he didn't even speak perfectly fluent Mandarin. He spoke a weird dialect that was, in the rural parts of China. What does this suggest? Well, it suggests that the ability to speak Italian or to speak Mandarin has nothing to do with the genes. The ability to learn anything was not in his genes. After all, if it was, why didn't he still have the Italian accent or whatever? Nothing. And did his intelligence change? No, he perfectly fit into and was doing the jobs of that are usually associated with people who live in rural China. He fit in there culturally. And he didn't fit in. We wanted to go back, and I think he visited Italy, and he couldn't stand the place, and he hated all the food. So that wasn't genetic. So is a person who is born Jewish genetically smarter, or have they been taught that? Take a rural Chinese person and plonk them down in the middle of Israel and have them brought up by Jewish parents in that culture, and I guarantee that they're going to have, they would do better than if on the IQ test, let's say, than if they'd been left in rural China. Yeah. But what do you think about the ESG movement in business, quality, social governance rules that decide on capital allocation owned by companies? Asset managers like BlackRock are promoting it. Yeah, it's interesting that BlackRock would be promoting it because you'd think they'd be interested in money. Look, let's face it, these even wealthy people are prone to the worst kinds of irrationalities. You don't have to watch Elon Musk. I mean, brilliant as he is, wealthy as he is, clearly he knows a lot of stuff, but he has blind spots in what he thinks about certain things. The AI apocalypse, for example. Like, I know he's wrong about that. I know he's wrong in being overly concerned about AGI taking over the world because he doesn't understand universal explainers and all that sort of stuff. But not many people do. But he's one of those people that wants to talk about it a lot without knowing the critiques of that perspective. So he's got a very narrow perspective. He's got Nick Bostrom's perspective. How could he be so deeply embedded in technology and yet have this blind spot? Well, it's because that's the culture, and he defers to the intellectuals who are sort of somehow ingratiated themselves into tech culture. So Nick Bostrom has somehow gotten himself in there. Will McCaskill, all these pessimists, Max Tegmark, they're all the same thing. What's that got to do with anything? Well, the ESG thing is the same. I mean, the whole socialist movement, it's absolutely astonishing that environmentalism, and so let's just face it, it's a form of Marxism, has gotten into corporations. Marxism and socialism hate the corporations. But the people that are in the corporations now have been trained that way through the universities. And it's, I would imagine, extremely difficult to speak up in those corporations now. The political culture inside those corporations is don't question the orthodoxy. Don't question the political orthodoxy because you will not get promoted. More and more, Jordan Peterson is excellent on this, talks about the human resource department that never used to exist a few decades ago. If you had the chief executive in a company, in a business, who called the shots, and the other executives called the shots. But now, in terms of hiring and firing of people, that power has been outsourced to this human resources department. And the human resources department are absolutely, completely trained by the universities as human resources people, which are Marxism through and through, nothing but. But many corporations believe they can only be good, virtuous corporations by having a human resources department. Why? Because they don't want to be accused. They don't want to be taken to court by their employees for sexism, racism, name your ism. Because too many have been sued. And so they think, well, the only way out of this is to not make the decision myself. As the chief executive, I can't make the decision on firing someone, because if God, God knows if it's a woman I need to fire and I'm a man, I'm going to be in all sorts of trouble. Or a person of a different skin color to me, I'm going to be in all sorts of trouble. So take the power away from me, the chief executive, and give it to the human resources department. And the human resources department is kind of like a union to some extent, politically motivated, ideological, and very powerful and influential. So this is the problem. So I'm not surprised that even a place like BlackRock, who's the wealthiest investment fund management company, would have a tendency to go in that direction. I think a lot of corporations do, and unless there's a reverse in the slide towards socialism, and there should be. I don't know what else to do. People just need to be more brave. The chief executives need to be more brave. Lawyers need to, if people get taken to court, lawyers and judges need to argue reality somewhat more. But at the moment, the entire culture is going into a particular direction there. So what do I think about it? I think it's anti-individual, anti-freedom, anti-profit, bad for business, ultimately. And this is the encounter of an idea with reality, and it'll be a refutation. Eventually, there has to be a refutation, whether by loss of profit or just people being presented with the better knowledge and the better understanding of reality, that things like merit mean something, that hiring people based on gender and skin color and diversity things. And as for environment, sorry, equality. Yeah. So but as for things like environment, which is what people are also concerned about now, sustainability type stuff, the same thing is going to occur. The corporations are absolutely embedded in this, taking on policies that are actively damaging to their own company and corporation in some way, shape, or form, because they think that this is what their customers want. And so far as I can tell, this is what one side of politics wants. So you're putting off, and this never used to be the case, of course. Never used to be the case that companies had they had policies on broad social issues. Why would we go to a corporation for commentary on a broad social or political issue? Stick with selling the burgers or the ice cream or making the money at the bank and whatever. But you go to the bank now and it's like rainbow flags and some environmental message or something or other. It's like, I don't need to hear this from you guys. Don't know anything. You don't know anything about this stuff. You should know about how to operate ATMs and ensure my credit card keeps working, that kind of stuff. Black Locust has asked, I heard you rail against mainstream education. I'm a teacher. I'm interested. Could you describe how a day at high school in your creation would function? Well, I wouldn't have high schools. I think that I worked in schools for a long time. And I think that, they're coercive. This is a whole philosophy. You gotta look up taking children seriously. But I think in the first instance on my website, it's just called Learning, www.bretthall.org/learning. And I explained there what my philosophy of education is, having worked in education for a long time, 15 years, too long. So yeah, the question itself is posed in a way that doesn't make any sense. Like, could I describe how a day at high school of your creation would function? I would not create a high school, so it wouldn't exist. No compulsion at all. Well, no school at all. Exams, absolutely no exams. Yeah. People are moving this direction, by the way. I think it's kids now, not everyone, a lot of kids, they know that learning the coding and learning the social media and learning the tech of today is the route to creativity, and that so much of what they do at school is completely and utterly useless. Every adult knows this, and every child knows this while they're doing the school. It's just that once they come out of school, for many people, the rose-colored glasses are put on and everyone thinks, oh, actually, school was really important and I really enjoyed it. No, you didn't. You hated it almost every moment you were there, and you wish you could have been doing anything else, and you wish you had the freedom. Okay. I'm just going to do rapid fire for the next few questions just so I can go off to dinner. Armin Critcher, please put these live stream recordings into the podcast feed as well. Okay, yeah, I might knit them together. Yeah, it just means I have to extract the audio and put them together, but I will do that. More podcasts with Naval coming. Nice question. I can't say anything right now, but let's just say I can't say anything right now. You have something to look forward to on that front. Let's just say that. Christo, does something have to be computable in order to exist? Does pi exist as a value, or is it just a function? Okay, so exist means feature in our best explanation. It doesn't mean computable. After all, uncomputable things exist. There are many statements in mathematics, in fact, the overwhelming majority of which cannot be computed or cannot be proved. They're valid statements, but we don't know if they're true or false. So you can't compute them. Pi exists as a number. You can represent it as you do. You could say pi. You could write the Greek symbol pi. So there you go. There's pi, right? Yeah, what is it? The ratio of the circumference to the diameter, pi. C over D, pi. There you go. Now, if you want to give the decimal expansion, well, then you've got an issue, because then the number just goes on forever. Can't be represented in the universe, because the digits exceed the ways in which you could represent them. Does that mean it doesn't exist? No, of course it does. Not being able to represent something in physical reality doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. It can still exist. 1/3 exists. Can we represent the decimal expansion entirely? No. It still exists, though. It's still, 1/3 is a meaningful thing. Pi is a meaningful thing, and it exists. Mathematical statements exist, whether or not they're represented in physical reality. My favorite go-to example of this is you can go to Wikipedia and look up the highest known prime number, and it'll tell you what it is. It's provably the case that there are infinitely many primes. So there is a next highest prime number, and one after that, and one after that. We know they exist, but where? Well, we haven't found them yet by definition. There's a highest one we know of right now. All those other ones exist, and they will, well, not all of them, the next highest one will be found soon, probably over the next year or so. And because of that, we know they exist, but they haven't been instantiated in physical reality yet. So there is a difference between the physical reality and the reality of abstractions. Where is this reality of abstractions? Well, I've dealt with this in many podcasts before, but it's the wrong question. Where asks for a place in space, which is back in physical reality again. But you're asking a question about abstract reality, which is not a space in physical reality. So there is no where this abstract space is. It's just that it exists, and abstractions are ways of thinking about numbers which can be represented in physical reality, almost all of which haven't been represented yet, because there's an infinite number of numbers. Okay, that's upvote comment. Do you have a writing system? Write when it's fun. As I get older, it's right in the morning, because as the evening goes on, I tend to become more easily distracted, let's say. So that's short. Alex, on alcohol, a problem is a conflict between ideas? Yes. Maybe alcohol seems to solve problems. Yes, correct. Yes. So one way of defining what a problem is, it's a conflict between ideas. So when you no longer have the conflict, good. Alex is exactly right. Yes, good point. Good. Thanks, Black Locust. Telescopes instantiate knowledge of how to create them. Last couple of questions. This one's from Alex. It says, you mentioned telescopes instantiate our knowledge of how to create them. They literally instantiate the laws of optics, but isn't this induction empiricism? Not at all. No. The only way of understanding, so when I say it instantiates the knowledge, it means if, let's say, all humans got wiped out tomorrow on the face of the earth, and an alien species came to Earth, and for whatever reason, they didn't know what a telescope was, but they found a telescope, then the only way of understanding what it did would be to explain what's going on. They'd eventually see that once the light goes through the main lens, it gets focused into the other lenses, and this object is for focusing light. They'd be able to reverse engineer the thing and eventually come up with an explanation of what it's for, what its purpose is, and how it does what it does. So it instantiates the knowledge of optics, because you'd need to have a theory of refraction and focusing and aberration, and presumably a whole bunch of stuff to do with telescopes. So it's explanation centered, conjecturing what this thing is and how it works. There's no induction or empiricism involved. Yeah, it's not, you're right. It said Alex said the information describing the laws isn't anywhere in the telescope. Not explicitly, implicitly. Yes. Or inexplicitly is better, actually. It's not written in words, but it can be written in words. But you need to conjecture the explanation first. Yeah. On what grounds do you think fallibilism can be criticized? Thank you. Well, I don't have any working. This is the whole point of a good explanation is a good explanation when you no longer have any criticisms of it. Does that mean it in principle can't be criticized? Of course not. You can try and criticize it all day long, but being unable to come up with criticism, well, it's not a proof that it's true. It can be your lack of imagination. But if it is a good explanation, if it's solving your problem and you can't come up with a criticism, you don't have a problem. So when you say, on what grounds can I criticize fallibilism? I can't. But it's not a problem for me. I don't need to. If it was a problem, if there was something going wrong, if I thought, oh, fallibilism is faulty and flawed or deficient in some way, then I'd try. But it's not incumbent upon me. If someone comes to me and says, I've got a criticism of fallibilism, I'm all ears. Often they get it completely wrong. They say, oh, fallibilism, so you don't believe in truth. No, I just don't believe the final truth can be found. Oh, so you're some kind of relativist. No, a relativist denies the fact that there is any truth. I say there is a truth and that we can pursue it by conjecturing ever better explanations, which allow us to gain more truth. But we are always fallible human beings. Oh, but you're saying that because you're a fallible human being, you can't know anything. No, you don't understand what knowledge is. Knowledge is not about getting to the truth. Knowledge is about creating ever better explanations. So people can misunderstand fallibilism, so they try and give me criticisms of fallibilism, but really they're giving me criticisms of something else, not understanding that fallibilism is a claim that you can be wrong about objective reality. So it entails realism. It entails a thing you can be wrong about. Yeah. Black Locust, where do you prefer sponsorship? Do you have a Patreon account? I do have a Patreon account. So for anyone else who's interested, you just go to www.bretthall.org, and on the front there are ways of donating via Patreon or PayPal. That's a lovely way to end it. Thank you for asking me that. Until next time, bye-bye, everyone. Thank you for joining in. It was a very active. I hope I can see you all again next time, because that was probably the best live chat I've done because of the quality of questions that came through. Black Locust. Thanks a lot, mate. See you next time.